by a show of hands, who here has ever been sailing? OK, so like a sort of a decent number of people. If you haven't, I highly recommend it if you ever get the chance. I am a big fan of sailing. I grew up sailing with my dad on Lake Michigan, and then when I was in high school, I actually ended up sailing competitively. And in my mind, sailing is sort of the ideal activity because it has several great features. Firstly, I think the technical aspects of it are very interesting. I think it's quite satisfying when you do it right. And under the right circumstances, it is also very relaxing. There are few experiences in this world that, in my mind, are as delightful as leaning out over the side of a boat on a sunny day with good wind blowing in from the east across the lake and like spray in the air. It's truly like, please go and experience that. If you take nothing away from the sermon, go do that, please. Also, please take other things from the sermon. The experience that Jesus and his disciples are having in our scripture for today, not like that one. In fact, it's definitely the opposite. When we join them, Jesus and the disciples are getting into a boat intending to make a small jaunt across the Sea of Galilee. We can imagine perhaps that Jesus and his disciples get to enjoy a few minutes of that sort of idyllic, nice sailing day before we can imagine that they get to enjoy a few minutes of that idyllic sailing experience I described to you earlier, sun on their faces, wind in their hair. And in fact, it's probably very relaxing, and they're having a good time, because Jesus goes and lies down on a cushion in the back of the boat and goes to sleep. The relaxation is short-lived, because as soon as Jesus goes to sleep, a wind whips up around the disciples. Now, the author describes this as a windstorm or a gale, and I think it's therefore easy to look at this and go like, oh, it's just like a little bit of like bad weather. But let me tell you, sailing in a storm, not fun. The problem with using a mode of transport that is powered by the wind is that when the wind moves twice as fast, you actually also start moving twice as fast. And that sounds fun until you have to do it, and it's actually not. If the wind is too strong, you also sometimes get blown over and capsize and end up in the water. And at the same time, if you try and lower your sail and stop moving, you are then stuck in the middle of a lake because the wind is how you move, and then you're just sort of trapped in the storm. And also, even if you lower your sail, maybe your boat still capsizes, because sometimes, if the wind is strong enough, that just sort of happens to you in storms. And additionally, the whole time, your boat is leaning about 10 to 20 degrees, and so you're climbing up and down this boat to try and not sink. So it's a really fun experience. I would also like to point out that in ancient Israel, it was mostly desert and hill country, so chances are people do not know how to swim. Some of the disciples were fishermen, so they're probably fine. But like when Matthew the tax collector ends up in the water, he's like out of luck. So this is not a good experience all around. From the perspective of the disciples, and also from our perspective of sailors today, the prospect of getting caught in a storm is daunting. Storms are confusing, unpredictable, and dangerous. It doesn't really matter how good a sailor that you are. When you see a flash of lightning in the sky while sailing, it's scary. Storms arise, and people can sometimes get hurt. And so we have to imagine that when Jesus and the disciples are caught in this storm, they are overwhelmed, panicking, and afraid. These are feelings that many of us are familiar with, not in the sense that we too have sailed across the Sea of Galilee and been caught in a windstorm. That's probably quite unlikely. But rather in the sense that when we live in community with other people, things go wrong. It may be that we say something which unintentionally hurts someone's feelings. Obviously, that's not ideal, but it does happen. Or perhaps we find out that someone who we previously thought was like us, or shared our ideologies, or we have broken bread with, is actually very different from who we thought they were. They might be so different that we wonder if we ever really knew them at all. It might be something as insignificant as cutting in front of someone when you're waiting downstairs for dinner, which, by the way, uncool. Or if someone says something which well and truly hurts you, which very uncool. And either way, storms arise in community all the time. And unfortunately, that's life. When we choose to live with other people, things are going to happen that aren't ideal or that challenge us in different ways, because we're human and we make mistakes. But this community, the one where we make mistakes unto others and others make mistakes unto us, this is the community that we have. And so Jesus calls us to do more than just be afraid when storms arise. He calls us to take action. And so sometimes we have to sail in these storms. As we discussed earlier, sailing in a storm, scary. Sometimes we have to sail through storms. Sometimes we have to sail through storms in communities. We might feel like the disciples, running around and shouting, "We are perishing," which is a feeling that I'm guessing many of us have experienced. So, what do we do? Well, we might look to the disciples for advice. After all, we know that they dealt with a similar situation and lived through it. So what did they do? In our scripture for today, we look to the disciples, and the disciples look to Jesus. Now, at this point in the story, Jesus is still asleep in the back of the boat. And the disciples, understandably, are a little bit peeved by this because they think they're going to die. And so they go to Jesus and they say, "Dude, how can you be sleeping right now? Wake up, we are going to die." Obviously, paraphrasing a little bit there. And so at this point in the story, Jesus conveniently wakes up. He stands up in the boat, and we're told that he rebukes the wind, which I like to imagine is just sort of him standing in the boat and like shaking his fist at the sky. But lo and behold, the wind stops and the waves subside, and the storm goes away. And everything goes back to being relatively calm. And then Jesus turns to the disciples and goes, "Guys, chill. Why are you all freaking out about this storm? Where is your faith?" Again, also paraphrasing. If you're like me, the first time that you read this story, you might have thought, "Jesus, that is a little bit rude." But let's take a moment to think about this from Jesus' perspective. Before the storm, the Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus has been traipsing around Galilee, casting out demons left and right, and healing people of previously incurable illnesses. Jesus lays hands on a leper and heals them. He heals a man with a withered hand. In the presence of Jesus, a paralyzed man learns to walk again, and unclean spirits bow down and confess him as the Son of God. In one instance, he even raises a young man from the dead and reunites the man with his mother. Jesus is out here in Galilee performing miracles and doing the impossible. So to Jesus, what's one storm? I have to imagine that from Jesus' perspective, it may be a foregone conclusion that their boat will make it through the storm, impossible as that might seem to the disciples, because Jesus is already out here doing impossible things left and right. Now, the disciples' fear in this situation, not unreasonable. They've never seen Jesus command the weather before, and so it's likely that this turn of events is somewhat unexpected to them. And, to be fair, the miracles that Jesus does are miraculous. They surprise us and they challenge our understanding and expectations of the world and how it works. So it's hardly surprising that when faced with this storm, the disciples are afraid and uncertain. At the same time, when we look at the text, we clearly see that Jesus knows the disciples have nothing to fear. He is with them, and no storm, no matter how strong or how overwhelming, can defeat Jesus, who even death could not defeat. I think this is an important lesson for us to take away from this text, because there are times in community when we will sail through storms. I can all but guarantee that at some point this year, you will have to do that. And to put it, in pretty straightforward terms, shit happens. And when we are in those storms, like the disciples, it may be that we too can only see the storm for the clouds, the community for its problems, and the people whom we love for our tensions that we have with them. At the same time, we are also followers of Jesus. This is the Jesus who tells us that when we are coming before God, we should first make right any grievances between us and our fellow community members, and then present ourselves to God. This is the Jesus who tells us to love those who we find ourselves enemies with and pray for those who persecute us, and that we should forgive those who sin against us again and again and again. If you're curious, the verses there are Matthew 5:23, 5:44, and 18:22. When we look to Jesus and his teachings, we have a map which teaches us how to sail through the storms that arise in community. In turning to Jesus and to his teachings, we find that the storm is not all that it may seem. For though it may appear scary when we're in the moment, these storms too shall pass, because Jesus is sailing with us. And so we find that the true problems that we face in community do not arise when the wind rocks our boats or when we quarrel with other people. These things happen. Jesus promises to be with us in these moments, And though we might not always know it at the time, he is walking alongside us. The true problems of life in community arise when we lose our belief that we can regain control of our ship, when we lose our belief that we can make it through the storms and out the other side. The good news I have for you today is this. With Jesus' help, we can make it through the storm. We can make it through all the storms that we face in community life. And so next time that you find yourself in a storm, I hope you will turn to Jesus. And then I hope you will turn back to your community rather than away from it. Because together, we can and we will chart a path through the rough waters and back into sunny seas. Thanks be to God.